Hello YouTube, welcome back. Have you ever wondered where it all began? I mean, not life, the universe and everything, but macadamia farming. Well, I thought I'd come and show you. I'm in the picturesque historic little town of Rouse Mill. It's about 10 k's out of Lismore in New South Wales, Australia, and I'm walking around the area, not the exact area because it's been lost, but the area of where the first commercial macadamia farm was planted. It's in Rouse Mill and it's rolling countryside. It's not dead flat, but it is in the Alstonville Plateau, so it's fairly flat. This is where in the 1880s a farmer called Charles Staff took an innovative approach and planted the world's first macadamia farm. Now, the macadamia had been discovered before then. It had been discovered really in the 1830s and 40s when the colonial settlers of Australia came past and saw that the Aboriginal people highly treasured the macadamia nut as a source of food. And while some measures were taken, such as the Queensland colonial government banning the chopping down of macadamia trees because it made the local Aboriginal people very upset, no real effort was made to farm them until the late 1880s when the first farm was established. Now, this is just a very well-run farm at the edge of Rouse Mill, but it's an example of the area where these trees were grown. Now, the species that were grown aren't the species that we eat today. These were seedlings of Macadamia tetraphylla that were grown on the farm. And that's a species that does create an edible nut, and it's part of some of our modern day macadamia varieties. But tetraphylla was the one that grew mostly in New South Wales. The ones we eat today are from further north in Queensland around the Gympie area. And that's where the next chapter of the macadamia industry history came, because the first farm here in Australia wasn't overly successful, even though people did love the macadamia nuts that came from it. That next stage of innovation came, as so many innovations do, from America. Now, I know you're expecting me to jump straight to a shot of Hawaii and me on Waikiki Beach, but unfortunately I don't have the budget to do that in this limited video presentation. Assume, though, that the next chapter of the story is in Hawaii in the 1920s and 30s, and from then on, right through to almost the 1960s, Hawaii had the industry to itself. It was supported by the Hawaiian Agricultural Experiment Station, which is now attached to the University of Hawaii. And it developed a lot of the macadamia varieties that are grown even in Australia today. It all started from a couple of people independently taking macadamia trees back to Hawaii. One of them wanted to use it for a windbreak, not for its nuts, but then it discovered that it fruited very well over there and started exploiting it for nuts. So Hawaii was the next real step, and for a while everyone thought of macadamias as a nut that came only from Hawaii. Some people even call it the Hawaii nut, and the industry persists there to this day. It's even growing a little bit again, which is pleasing to see. But the next real stage of the macadamia industry happened back here in Australia. But it wasn't here in Rouse Mill. Interestingly, it was somewhere else. In the 1960s, macadamia production returned to Australia in Dunoon. Now, Dunoon was selected because it had very high rainfall, volcanic soil, some plateau country, not heaps, but certainly enough to be going on with, and a lot of these old orchards were planted by CSR, which was at the time Australia's biggest sugar producing company. What did they want with macadamias? Well, look, we'll never exactly know, but they planted a great big plantation at Dunoon. I'm not looking at it, but another one planted at about the same time by the Hargraves family was planted on this estate called Alamo. And that faintly ridiculous looking homestead in the distance is where the Hargraves family set up their large orchard of macadamias. And it was interesting because after CSR's experiment, we had a lot more experimentation done by people and businesses much smaller than CSR. And it was them that took the industry forward to the next stage. Now, the late 70s and 80s were, I suppose it's an ugly term, but I'd like to call it the tax dodge era, where the macadamia industry was grown very much by wealthy individuals who wanted to defer income by sinking their money into macadamia farms. And as a tax measure, it was very effective because macadamias took 8 years to bear a crop. And in the meantime, you incurred lots of very tax deductible losses that you could use to reduce your income from the very heavily taxed levels to lower taxed levels in Australia. And funnily enough, that tax system, which was actually very punishing, produced a result in that a lot of farms were planted that otherwise never would have been. This one's in Rosebank, but the area around Rosebank, Eureka, Newrybar, Nashua, a lot of the areas around the Eureka Plateau were planted for this very reason in the 70s and 80s. So the industry grew, and the farms weren't huge commercial ventures because they didn't have to be. It just had to be enough to sink someone's taxable income into. And so these days you could say a lot of the farms aren't really a commercial size, although at given levels they can produce a profit like any other farm, and they can actually be run quite cost effectively. This particular farm you've seen before in one of my macadamia annual reviews. But if you want some more information on that particular era and how the Northern Rivers developed as a macadamia district, go back to my shows with Bruce Chester in the Macadamia Show. He was very much part of that era and explained the motivations and the methods in which people planted farms very much like this one. So after the Eureka area, the next place that was planted out with macadamias was the Austinville Plateau. And until then, the area had been used for peanuts, citrus and other crops. But it started getting planted out with macadamias because there were wide areas of flat land, good red volcanic soil, which you can see here, and it quickly overtook the Eureka area because of that abundance of good flat land, which made farming quite easy. I'm here in Lindendale at the moment, and actually this is an interesting example of a farm. You can see this farm employs what's called hedging, where the sides of the trees are shaped, and certainly the row nearest to the road here looks healthy enough, although those trees in the middle aren't getting too much light on the side of the trees. Hedging's a practice that's pretty yesteryear now, but there are still farms that apply it and maintain taller trees instead of the heavy pruning method of rejuvenation that farmers now tend to favour. Anyway, this area is now still the largest area in New South Wales where macadamias are grown. A little later on, and I find it hard to put a time frame on it, but the Nambucca area of New South Wales, which is a bit further south, was also settled and planted out with macadamias near Valor and other places similar to that. It's become a slowly growing area for growing macadamias, and certainly in terms of results, it's a good area for it. but it hasn't in any way come close to this Alstonville Plateau as far as New South Wales is concerned. But the Alstonville Plateau in the 80s and 90s was nothing but a child's playground compared to what happened in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And that's way over those mountains in the distance, up in Bundaberg. Now, that area was settled again, lots of abundant flat land, a lot cheaper than the northern rivers. Needed a bit of irrigation because there wasn't enough rainfall, but there was such an enormous area that could be planted with macadamias that it rapidly became Australia's largest macadamia growing district, and it still is today. In fact, it's still expanding today. And the Bundaberg area, which again I can't take you to, I'm sorry, but you'll just have to take my word for it, is a massive operation where there are very large farms, many times the size of the mum and dad farms you see dotted around the northern rivers. And so it was that era, the early 2000s, when we took over the mantle from Hawaii as being the largest macadamia producing country in the world. And that's where it went from there, at least until South Africa took over. So the South African transition happened really in about the late 2009 to say 2020 period, and it's still going. It took over from Australian production in about 2011 and went on from there. And it was an interesting transition because, you know, at this stage, all of the industries in the world were growing. There was a lot of interest in the macadamia because the prices were going up and starting to go up in a continual way. And the interest then grew to other parts of the world. We had substantial plantings in Kenya, Malawi, a couple of other African countries that had compatible climates for growing macadamias. And it then really became a bit of a world crop, so long as the climate matched. And of course, that's the hard thing with macadamias, finding an appropriate climate where the flowers won't get rained on and moisture comes at the right time of year to fill the nuts with the hydrocarbon that is macadamia oil. The support for the industry changed as well, because until the Australian industry sort of took over, the Hawaiian research efforts basically supported the entire world. But in the 1990s, the Hawaii Agricultural Experiment Station shut down its efforts. They got to the low 900s in terms of the varieties that they developed. The last notable one, I think, was variety 905, which never made it to Australia as far as I know. But Australia, when it planted trees, relied partly on Hawaiian varieties, and in the case of these trees, partly on Australian own varieties. This one is the H2, which, despite the letter H, does not mean Hawaiian. So by the time it got to South Africa was using some Hawaiian varieties, some of the A varieties, which were developed in Australia by Hidden Valley Plantations, and they even developed one or two varieties of their own. And in that early 90s, as the Hawaiian research tailed off, the Australian research began. And it's that early 90s research that took well over 20 years to produce the new varieties that are now being recommended to the Australian industry today. Now, I don't know whether they're spreading around the world. As far as I know, they're not supposed to, but I wouldn't be surprised if they find their way overseas sooner rather than later to the various macadamia growing countries. And so the industry we have today is still a growing industry. There's a price depression at the moment, which you could say is partly caused by the huge increase in production in South Africa. Australia caused one of its own, though, back when we were competing with the Hawaiians, and a lot of Australian production came online. So we have to let demand recover a bit. but then we go on to bigger and better things, hopefully. The latest report from the Australian Macadamia Society shows increased crop forecasts in just about every macadamia growing region of the world, except China, who've put down a 10% reduced forecast. I wouldn't put too much stock by the forecasts of those industries. With the price so low, well, you might actually produce that number of nuts, but whether they're ever going to get harvested is another matter. So we'll see what the numbers come in arrears and see how that affects the world market. So guys, thank you for watching this little history of the macadamia farm development as an industry. Hope you enjoyed it and hope you enjoyed the pictures that go with it. I'm going to go back and do some work. My slashing is yet to be done, and so I'll focus on that, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Bye for now.